So hello, we're going to be working on the quadratic formula, and the first idea was for you guys to memorize the formula. So here's a song to help you out with that.
The quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a.
Alright, so if one of you guys wants to remix that or come up with something better, you're welcome to. But memorizing the song could help you memorize the formula a little quicker. But I'm going to work through this assignment, and as I said on Friday, we were going to have a test to make sure that you memorize this formula. So let's do an example. Okay, we're going to be working on problems that I didn't do in class. So we'll start with number 4. All right, the first step would be to rewrite the formula. And in this case, I know it can be kind of confusing because we have two different versions of the letter B to deal with. And in this case, it's just something that we're going to have to deal with. Okay, so we want to be able to distinguish between the B that symbolizes the variable here, and what we usually have is our values of A and B and C when we're working with a quadratic equation. Okay, and so with this formula, we consider B to be the value that is in front of x, the coefficient of our linear term, whereas A is the coefficient of the quadratic term, and C is our constant term, right? So we want to be able to distinguish the difference between these two. I know this polynomial right now has B also as a variable, and that can be confusing, but we want to actually not get confused by that, right? So let's go ahead and figure out, in this case, A would be equal to 2. B would be this invisible 1 right here, and C would be negative 21. Okay, so as I taught everybody in class today, we will be using this idea of putting blank parentheses everywhere where we see a letter. So before I substitute in my values into the formula, we're going to go ahead, everywhere that I see a letter, I'm going to put a blank parentheses, but everything else will be copied, right? So I saw negative B, so I put negative parentheses. Then I see the plus or minus, so I copy that. I copy the square root symbol. But now that I see another letter, I see B squared, so I'm going to put a blank parenthesis squared. Then I'll put minus 4 and a blank parenthesis and another blank parenthesis. And at the bottom, we have 2 times A, and so I'll put 2 and then have a blank parenthesis. Okay? So the very next step would be for us to go ahead and put in the values. So B is equal to 1. Okay, as far as the formula is concerned, we're going to plug in B is equal to 1. And then for B again, in this case, right, we can see that B squared is what goes in this place, right, as we look at the formula over here. B squared. So for B, I will plug in 1 again. Now we can see that it's negative 4AC, and so I'm going to plug in 2 for A, and because we have C, the next value that I'll plug in is negative 21 for C. On the bottom of our equation, we have this divided by 2A, and so A is going to be 2 times 2. In this case, we'll plug in A for 2 right there. So this would be our first step, and as we do this work, we're going to go through and now calculate. We're going to get a value. So we have the negative outside of the parentheses with the 1, so that just becomes negative 1. Then we have plus or minus the square root, and we have 1 squared in parentheses, so that just becomes 1 because 1 squared is 1. And now what I teach everybody is to put your minus sign, but then give 1 blank parentheses. Okay, and in this parentheses, we're going to put in the value that I get when I multiply 4 times 2 times negative 21. Okay, and in this case, I would get 4 times 2 is 8, and 8 times negative 21 is going to give us negative 168. So we now have to calculate the bottom value, and that is going to be 2 times 2, which is 4. So part of the reason why we did it in this order was going to be so that we would end up with 1, okay, and we'd be able to see this negative minus, right, that we're subtracting a negative number. And if you leave out that parentheses, it can be easy to kind of slip your mind that you didn't include the negative. So to subtract negative 168 really means to add 168, right? So that double negative, we're going to be able to control that situation and make sure we don't mess that up by using these blank parentheses that I put right here. Okay, so do that every time before you go multiply these numbers together. Use those blank parentheses. Okay, now this is all divided by 4. So in this case, I'm going to push everything up so that we can have a way to continue our work. So if you need to copy the rest of this work into your notes or something, you go ahead and rewind the video. So now we're going to continue working and simplifying our value. So now we have negative 1 plus or minus the square root. And in this case, we can combine our 1 with our positive 168. We can add those two numbers up, and that gives us 169. Then we're going to divide all of that by 4. Okay, and then we should kind of recall what happened before when we use square roots. We always end up with that plus or minus sign. And so we're going to have to do 2 calculations, right? But before we do that, we have to actually get the square root of 169. And in this value, it works out to be exactly 13, right? The square root of 169 is 13, because 13 times 13 makes 169. So let's do our 2 calculations, right? We'd have to do negative 1 plus 13 divided by 4. Or we get our other possible value, which would be negative 1 minus 13 divided by 4. So at this case, we have 2 calculations to do. We'll have to divide these by 4, and then we'll reduce the fractions as is possible. And if it's necessary, we'll continue going until we get them completely reduced all the way. So again, if you have to, I'm going to make some more room. So if you need to rewind the video to copy some of this, just go ahead, pause it, and go back and get the part that you need. So we're going to continue working here. And the last 2 calculations that we need to have is going to be the idea that negative 1 plus 13 is positive 12 over 4. Or we have our other value, which is negative 1 minus 13, which makes negative 14 over 4. All right, now I was happy to see some students got this right on their own at the end of the day. So, 12 over 4 does break down into 3. Okay, and I think, again, one of my students that did get this problem all the way right, they got to this last step, and then they kind of left it like this. And this isn't something that you'd want to do on like a test, especially like the SAT or any other standardized test. They'll probably have you break that down. So you'd want to be sure that you can take that 14 over 4 and reduce it, right, to negative 7 over 2, right? And again, that's because on top, negative 14 is the same thing as negative 7 times 2, and 4 is the same thing as 2 times 2, right? And so we would be able to cancel out these 2's, and you'd be left with negative 7 over 2. So there's where we get our 2 answers. All right, like I said, to save space and time right now, I'm just going to erase these, but you might want to include a separate line on your homework, right? So we get 2 separate answers, right? These would be the solutions to our equation, all right? 3 or negative 7 over 2, right? So, like I said, to get the meaning out of this again, what are we doing when we solve these things and we get when they're equal to 0? Let's keep these numbers in mind. 3 and negative 7 over 2, okay? For today, we're going to keep these we'll keep this one as a fraction, right? But you should also keep in mind, that negative 7 over 2 would be the same thing as like negative 3/2, right? And so, just for the sake of it, I know today with all the formulas and square roots, nobody really wanted to go look at a graph, but because we have time in the video, what I'm going to do is jump into Desmos, and I'm going to graph this equation for you, 2b squared plus b minus 21, and we're going to try to find out when it's equal to 0, and you're going to realize that, you know, like we did before we went to break, those are the x-intercepts, right? The x-intercept should be at 3 and negative 3.5, right? So let's go take a look at that. Let's go to Desmos and jump in and see what's going on here so that we have a little bit more understanding of what's going on with this whole process. Why are we doing this? So we get here, Desmos. We'll type in f of x equals, I believe it was 2x squared, and then it was plus b minus 21. So we'll put plus x minus 21, and this is basically the same equation. I know the variable is different, but that's really not the important thing here in this case, right? The important thing is that we have the same pattern, right? We got 2x squared, 2 times our variable squared, plus the variable itself minus 21, okay? So we were talking about the intercepts, and you can see that one of them is at negative 3.5, and the other one would be at 3. So you can see these were our two solutions. So when we solve a quadratic equation, when it's equal to 0, we're trying to find the x-intercepts. This is telling me that when I plug in 3, I'll get 0, and you can see that point is right here on the graph. And likewise, if I plug in negative 3.5, I'd also get 0. Okay, so yeah, we might be able to solve this equation by factoring or something else, some other kind of way, but it's important to have the different methods for solving these equations, and so this would be the way to attack this problem specifically. Alright? So I know that took a while to get through that example, but again, I went slow. So number 5 we did in class. Number 6, I'll have a little talk about this one with you guys too. So let's try to get through number 6 in this video. So, like I said before, right, the variable is n in this case, so we know because it's all equal to 0, I can apply the quadratic formula, and in this case our formula works with negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so the more times you copy it, the less likely you will be to forget it. Okay, we know that a is going to be the value that is the invisible coefficient of our quadratic term. We know b is going to be the coefficient of the linear term, and the c is the constant term. So we have a equals 1, b equals 10, but c equals negative 15 because there's a negative sign there. So as I told you in the last example, we'd be having blank parentheses everywhere where we see a letter. And we would then plug in the numbers after we have all of our places for them to go into. Yeah. So here we go. Let's go ahead and plug in our value for b, right? Because we have negative b as this first value. So negative b, we're going to turn that into 10 right here. 10 just goes right there inside the parentheses. We'll put 10 here also in this place because that's b squared. And then because this next parenthesis is asking for a, we'll put 1. And then so it's 4ac right here that we see. And so that means that we should put the value of c in this parentheses, which would be negative 15. And then for a, we'll have 1. So now we just go ahead and finish our calculation like we did before. We're going to take negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 10 squared, which is 100. Okay, so we can do that calculation, but before we calculate this next thing, we put minus, and then we put one big blank parenthesis. All right, doing this will stop us from making a mistake when we calculate the number underneath the square root, because it can be easy to drop one negative when you're dealing with so many numbers, right? So again, we're just going to treat 4 like it's a positive number. Don't worry about this negative out front here. Don't worry about that. Okay, for now we're just going to do 4 times 1, which is 4, and 4 times negative 15, which is negative 60. So in this parentheses, I'm going to write negative 60. Now, we simplify everything. Okay, we continue. And this time, we're going to express the idea that minus negative 60 means to really add 60. Okay, and then this is all divided by 2. So to do a little bit more work on this line, we would have negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 160, and then everything divided by 2. So I'm going to push everything up again. If you need to copy all of that, then just rewind the video. But otherwise, I hope you're following along pretty well. All right, but I'm going to delete this stuff. So if you need that line still, go ahead and just rewind and copy it. Okay, so this next step, we have negative 10 plus or minus, and we need to figure out what the square root of 160 is. And so we've been studying repeated roots for a while, right? And so we know that this looks a lot like 16 times 10, and 16 times 10 is just like 4 times 4 times 10, right? So we could break that down even more, times like 2 times 5, right? And the only repeated factors that we have here are these two 4s, right? So that means that we're going to be able to pull a 4 outside of the square root sign, and the 2 times 5, those don't have a repeated factor, right? So those will have to stay inside. So in this case, we can change this to look like negative 10 plus or minus 4 times the square root of 10, because 2 times 5 is 10, and that's what's left inside. And here we have 2. So there's a lot of different ways to attack this. I mean, there's more than one way to do this. It depends how you think about it. What might be easy to one person might look more confusing. So for me, I like just teaching you guys to do the subtraction ahead of time, and then we'll just break down the numbers as we go along. So we're going to do negative 10 plus 4 root 10 over 2, or negative 10 minus 4 root 10 over 2. Okay, and I know that got kind of messy over here, so I'm going to try to fix that. So, in this example, we have a bunch of numbers that are still able to be reduced, right? You can see that both of them are even, right? So I could split this up into 2 more numbers, and like I said, there's more than one way to do this. I think the easiest way, is really what works for you. It's not necessarily for everybody. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to factor out a 2 from these expressions, okay? So what I should be able to see is that 10 and 4 have a common factor. So I could factor out a 2, and inside I would have negative 5 plus or minus 2 root 10. And look how it's all over 2. Okay, again, if I was to multiply this 2 times that, that would give me the negative 10. And if I was to multiply 2 times 2, that would give me the 4 that I have right here. So we factored out that 2 because we can see that we can divide it out, right? Because I know that I want to try to eliminate that 2. So because we have a 2 on top and bottom, we can cancel those out. And then we see that our final answer would basically be just negative 5 plus 2 root 10. Okay? And the same thing would happen with the other value, right? We would see that I have a 2 that I can factor out, and then inside I could continue to have a negative 5, just like the last time, but this time it would be a, oh, it looks like I forgot to not copy the whole symbol. Okay, so in this case we would have a minus 2 root 10 over 2, and now, like I said last time, we could cancel out these 2's. Okay, so we would be left with negative 5 minus 2 root 10. Okay, we could also just think of it as us dividing each one of these little numbers by 2, right? I have to divide the 10 by 2, which makes 5, and the 4 by 2, which makes 2. And of course, right, since that's negative 10, I would get negative 5. And because this is a positive 4, we would end up with positive 2 in this case. And we'd end up with, because this 4 is negative, we'd end up with a negative 2. So there we go. We have our 2 possible answers. We have negative 5 plus 2 root 10. That cannot be simplified anymore. You could try to turn that into a decimal value, but for the purposes of this assignment, we're just working on the basic idea of using the exact value, leaving it as a square root, okay? So there we go with this example. I've been trying to keep the video short for this case, so I'll go ahead and stop it now. If you guys need help on number 8, we'll work on that in class. So, good luck with that. All right, take this to help you out with the homework, and I'll see you guys later.